Hello everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Gaming in the Wild, a video games podcast about games from the artistic, creative side of the tracks, from indie to AAA. My name's John, I'm your host, and here in Reykjavik, it's a summer evening. I've been actually kind of sick all week, so I haven't been out enjoying the sun, but a high point of my week this week was that I had a good conversation with Yuts of Geography of Robots. Geography of Robots is the developer of NORCO, a game that I covered a couple of episodes ago and was really transfixed by and think it's a very interesting game. And they agreed to come onto the podcast and talk about that game. So this week's episode is a special interview episode where I talk with Yuts about the making of NORCO, about the region, about the subject matter of the game. And it kind of went in some interesting directions, actually. We ended up talking about media diet and ideas of reality and all kinds of cool stuff. So thanks very much to Yuts for coming on the show, and I hope that you enjoy the great conversation that we had. It's quite a long chat that we had, so I'll keep this intro quite short. I have been playing a couple of other things this week. I played a little bit of Silt, a new indie game that came out that looks a lot like Limbo, but underwater. Had a bit of a rough time with that one, didn't play too much of it, so I moved on to play Chorus. This is a game that came out on Game Pass. It's a space flight, open galaxy type of game with lots of map markers to fly between and a highfalutin story about a space cult, and a little bit like the Guardians of the Galaxy story, actually, if you played that game, where there is a cult that is drawing everyone in, and you trying to escape from that as a crack pilot. And I actually had quite a lot of fun with Chorus. There was some talk about it on the show's Discord that made me play it, actually. People were really picking up on this one and saying that it was worth checking out. And I've been playing that one for several hours whilst I've been sitting around feeling like crap, and it's been pretty good. It's been a nice potboiler spaceflight game with some very pretty graphics. And I'll be talking about that one again over the coming weeks for sure. I've also been dipping back into Cyberpunk, which seems to be something that I say every week, but I'm really enjoying that game, honestly. I reviewed it earlier in the year, the version 1.5 release of Cyberpunk. I keep going back to it, and you can just play for a couple of hours and drive around in Night City, do some tasks, finish off some side quests with cool stories that you hadn't done during your main playthrough. So I'm still dipping back into that one all the time, and having a great time with it. I'm becoming a bit of a convert to this game. I'm really seeing it in the top tier of open world games now. It's right up there for me with the very best of the genre. I was a huge Fallout fan, and this one is inching ahead of Fallout 4 for me now. I think the longer that people wait to play it, the better it's going to get. There is DLC coming, and every new patch seems to fix more and more. I played it after the recent V1.52 patch, and it stopped crashing on PlayStation 5. It was crashing about every hour. So Cyberpunk is in better shape than ever. I really recommend people try that if you're a fan of open world games, of RPGs, of sci-fi worlds. It's a really good one. But the final thing before we move on to that chat with Yuts about NORCO is that I will mention this show is listener supported. If you would like to support the show and get extra episodes, you can do so at patreon.com/gaminginthewild. Big thank you to all my existing patrons, and a big thank you to you if that's something that you're interested in. I'd also like to say thank you to people that have been leaving reviews of the podcast on iTunes and rating it on Spotify. I've noticed those reviews and those ratings coming in. So thanks very much to everyone who's doing that. I really appreciate it. Helps other people find the show. And I hope you enjoy this episode. Here it comes. This is my chat with Yuts of Geography of Robots about the game NORCO. All right, so I'm very happy to be joined this week by Yuts from Geography of Robots, the developer behind NORCO. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Really happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for making the time to do it. I played NORCO after hearing a little bit of a buzz around it this year online, and people were comparing it to some games that I love, and that was enough to get me straight onto it, and found it to be a really intriguing game. So I'm really happy to have the chance to talk to you about it, because I had a lot of questions after I played it.
Understandably.
But I guess I should say that this is, might contain a few spoilers. I guess probably if people are wanting to play the game, it might be a good idea to maybe play it before listening to this one, or go back and listen to the NORCO review episode, which I'll put a link to, because we will be talking about some kind of plot stuff and some of the deeper subject matter that maybe doesn't happen right away. But I was wondering if you could start, actually, because NORCO is a game that is pretty multifaceted and has a lot going on. So I thought it'd be interesting if you could just describe the game in your own words to begin.
Yeah, the game's a point-and-click adventure game. It takes inspiration from a lot of older text adventures like Deja Vu or Snatcher. So it's presented in a pretty conventional adventure game format. It blends a few other genre conventions into it, but I think what's more important to me, and I think what defines it as a unique experience, is that it is a meditation on geography, and I guess you could say the psychogeography of South Louisiana, that it uses those genre conventions as a medium through which it explores the wetlands of South Louisiana, the religious geography, Catholicism, urban development, climate change, all of these different dimensions of the region. It explores those and kind of gamifies them and narrativizes them in various ways.
Right, and from what I've read it, like a few other bits and bobs online about NORCO. As I said after the game, I was kind of one of those games where you really feel like you just have to keep digging after the end. Like the end of the game feels just like the beginning in some way. But during reading some of the things about the game, I read that you were actually from around that part of the world. Is that right?
Yeah, I grew up in NORCO. I lived in the New Orleans region until just a few years ago, and I'm actually moving back soon. But yeah, I know the region really intimately, and I've explored it through different projects over the years. And NORCO really is a distillation of a lot of different projects and experiments and ideas related to the regional geography.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I had no idea that NORCO was a real place. Like, I hadn't heard of this place before playing the game, and so kind of discovered it through the game, in a way, and was really surprised to find out that this dystopia that's created in the game has actually got like a pretty firm foot in reality, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right. It's a really industrialized place, and I've discussed this elsewhere, and I am not trying to be evasive when I say this, but in writing the script for the game, and I was working by the end of the project. It started as a solo project, but I was working in close collaboration with a few other people to get it finished in the last year or two of production. And so we were all, I think, of a single mind that we didn't intend to tell a dystopian story, that there were just all of these various social tendencies and material realities that we were interested in exploring that are largely a reflection of the truth. You know, that you're sometimes looking at the truth through a kind of funhouse mirror, but in terms of the hold that the petrochemical industry has on Louisiana, that's the least fictional part of the game. NORCO is a refinery town, And the Shell oil refinery in Shell has a lot of sway, and the oil lobby in general has a lot of clout in Baton Rouge, the state capital of Louisiana. So a lot of what's depicted in the game that seems dystopian is simply borrowing from reality.
Right, and I remember you very generously retweeted the first review episode about NORCO, and I remember saying in that one that the idea, because NORCO is an acronym for a company, right? It's the New Orleans Refining Company.
That's right.
And so the real town of NORCO is actually named after the company. Is that right?
Yeah, that's accurate. Before it was Shell, it was a local refinery that was called the New Orleans Refining Company, and that's where the acronym came from. And that facility ended up becoming part of Shell's complex. They bought it when they moved into the region, but yeah, it was originally a refinery, and a town grew up around it. And before that, it was called Sellers, and it was actually a plantation. There was plantation land there. There were enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, who settled around there. So it had a history before Shell moved in, but NORCO was the acronym that ended up on the map.
Right. And I remember that kind of leapt out to me. I remember sort of stopping in my tracks when I read the fact that the town was just named after the company. I've never encountered that before. That normally it's been that a town will have a name, and there may be companies like it may be a mining town, or it may be like an industrial town of some kind. But for the town to be named after the company as if it is just part of the company was something kind of new, and it shocked me a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it's indicative of just how much of a hold and how much persuasion that industry has in Louisiana. I think it's difficult to overstate. And when you're there, when you're living there, you realize just how many just how the tendrils just extend into every other industry. They extend into the art world, into your social life, everything. It's really, there is just kind of this ubiquitous presence of the oil industry in Louisiana.
Mm-hmm. Right, but as the game explores, there is a lot more there besides. As you said, there is history that predated the arrival of the company, and there is obviously the natural environment around the town, and the game dips into all of those things. I was interested to see on your Twitter bio that you've listed swamps, refineries, GIS, code, and ecology as interests of yours. And the game does seem to tie all of those together. And is it right that you've done some academic research into the area as well as the work that you've done, and that this game perhaps ties together a lot of things that you've done until now?
Yeah, that's exactly. It's almost in a way a kind of capstone of various other projects, largely geospatial in nature, making maps and mapping software. And then also I'd conducted an oral history project with a close friend years before NORCO, but a lot of that research got folded into it. I wrote my thesis on the ways in which the petrochemical industry impacts urban development patterns in the River Parish region of Louisiana between Baton Rouge and NORCO. So yeah, all of those things I think got, that was the foundational, or I should say part of the foundational substratum of the game, and a lot of other things got heaped on top of it. Observations about social media, the COVID experience, everything else.
Mm-hmm. Right, and the game, it does have a very rich texture to it, like the people that you meet, the dialogue, and the descriptions, and the locations themselves. Like even if they are still screens with a little bit of animation on them, there's just the way that they've been picked, such as like the Ghost Bayou area with a sort of fishing spot where hardly anyone is, and there's just quite a lot of slightly haunting locations that just seem to have a bit of texture to them. And I guess that must come from, as you've said, like your experience of living and growing up around there and seeing these places firsthand, and maybe, I guess, picking them for that reason, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, a lot of credit goes as well to the other pixel artist on the project, Jesse Jacoby, who's never been to Louisiana in his life, but through close collaboration, we were able to, in my opinion, create a very convincing depiction of Louisiana. And a lot of the locations are direct, within 15 miles of where I grew up, and I spent a lot of time wandering around those areas, kayaking around those areas, swimming in Lake Pontchartrain, wandering around the suburbs of New Orleans, getting on built. I feel like in the early 2000s, in the subculture that I was a part of, I feel like, and maybe this is true just in general, because I feel like this was an era of a lot of urban divestment, and there was a lot of abandonment and stuff, but urban exploration was such just a popular pastime in the early 2000s, I feel like. So pulling from those experiences of just intimately exploring greater New Orleans, and that type of experience and that type of exploration took a kind of primacy in the development of the game, where there were these specific spots that were very resonant places in the metropolitan area that dictated, in a way, the way that the narrative unfolded. And so the pixel art and the depictions of the landscape, a lot of thought and a lot of painstaking attention went into that.
Right, and it is a quality that, I mean, even though it's fiction, and sometimes it's science fiction, and sometimes it's quite sort of speculative, and sometimes it's quite wild and even silly and funny at times, the whole game. But there is like this texture that runs through it. It does feel grounded. It does feel like grounded in the region, but also in the story. I mean, it's the story. It's told on two timelines. One of which is a mother who has been researching the area. And got sort of wound up in some intrigue. And when we meet her, she's trying to make money and trying to set her affairs in order, and she knows that she's dying. And then on a separate timeline, it's the story of a daughter who left and ran as far as she could go, kind of, and then has been come back to deal with her mother's death and to deal with the posthumous affairs and all that sort of stuff. So, I mean, it's a personal family story in a way, but it's set inside of this this interestingly textured and very grounded sort of reality, and it's quite multifaceted in that way. But is that something? I mean, even though it's fiction, is that something that you've and the characters in the game and that sort of thing? Is it drawn from like your experience and watching others and being aware of other people's lives and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd mentioned that they're part of the DNA of the project is this oral history project. It borrows a bit of stuff from that. It borrows from my own personal experiences. It borrows from historical events in Louisiana and the experiences of people I love. And, Duck is a kind of quintessential Louisiana archetype. There are a lot of these fence-lined communities in Louisiana of people, largely descendants of formerly enslaved people who ended up just through circumstances of history living next to oil and gas refineries right along the fence line, and have, a lot of these communities have fought for buyouts basically to get moved. And so Duck is one of these characters where the life experiences of various figures in Louisiana, some of them are high profile. If you research Diamond, Louisiana, which was a neighborhood inside of NORCO, you'll see an example of one of these campaign buyouts, and you'll see various figures in that buyout effort who resemble Duck and who tell stories that are similar to Duck's. And so a lot of the characters are much like Duck. They're archetypes. They weave together and create composites out of these quintessentially, Louisiana and Gulf South experiences.
Right. Yeah, and there are some really, it's a really colorful cast that we have in this game. Like the private investigator you spend some time with, the various members of a mall cult, a cult that has occupied an abandoned mall. One of the first people you meet, a shop clerk whose job has been taken by a machine. I guess it's framed as sci-fi in the game, but I mean, I was just in a store today and noticed that the all the staff were gone and was beeping my own stuff on the way through.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
So it's very much kind of happening, even if in the game it's like, it looks like a sci-fi robot that's serving you, or feels that way at least. So there is this way in which the game, I would say, it was an interesting fracture that I found myself on, where I felt like I had one foot in a near future science fiction and one foot in reality, in quite an interesting way. Like near future sci-fi is not often as near as it is in this game. And I wondered if that was there are moments where things that you're reading as sci-fi on the screen and in the game perhaps hit home, and you think, well, actually this is happening. It was like a kind of an uncanny moment that you get, like a little rug pull or something.
There's definitely no, science. It's helpful to leverage certain genre tropes just because they're legible to players, but kind of in the same vein as what I commented on with dystopian, these dystopian characteristics of the game. Really, we were leaning on some of these tropes, but we didn't have an explicit intention of creating a sci-fi game. But of course, I think with these genre categories, it's like whatever is helpful to communicate what it is perfectly fine. But really, a lot of it is almost like parody or slight exaggeration of contemporary technology, and is used to create more of a kind of almost a kind of dream logic of stretching truth and stretching reality in various directions, and sometimes stretching the reality towards the future, sometimes towards the past, sometimes in other oblique directions. And I think more than anything, a lot of those characteristics of the game were used just to create a kind of perpetual disorientation as you're playing through the game, to keep things loose, to keep your interpretation of the world and what's happening somewhat loose, and your mental model of what it should be, or what should be happening next, somewhat loose, and to cultivate a kind of open-mindedness towards the world that the game creates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were many moments in it where I would find myself reading it and playing it as fiction, and then have a little moment where I thought, wait a second, this, like one of the examples that I've got here is the ditch man, who believes that the descendants of Jesus live in Louisiana, and he is seeking them out. And I was thinking, this could be wild fiction, or it could be like a story that you might read in a local paper, like You know what I mean? So I was wondering if some of these things are like plucked from imagination, or if they are plucked from reality, like that example.
Yeah, even that is has some basis in reality. I'm blanking on the title, but there was a local book that I don't want to use the word amateur, but let's say an informal researcher had written about the Holy Bloodline making its way to Louisiana via the Acadians. from France to Nova Scotia, down the Mississippi River to South Louisiana. And so that's also has some basis in reality, and just going into various Facebook groups and online forums and things like that. So I think most of, all of the far-fetched ideas in the game, I try, and this is maybe more explicitly depicted through SuperDuck, but that, I think we wanted to keep them literally rooted in certain ways, literally rooted in the region. So trying to cultivating these ideas and letting them grow from the soil of Louisiana and greater New Orleans.
Mm-hmm. Right, and there's a lot of other stuff packed in there that is on that edge as well, that edge of strangeness. But some of them felt almost like, as someone that hasn't really spent any time in the US outside of like visits to New York City, but watches from afar, as we all do, and sees what's happening in the news and kind of has a sense of the kind of political schism and religious schism that's going on in the States, and the kind of the QAnon stuff and all of that kind of things that we read about, There were moments in the game where, for example, in the refinery, you go into the sort of headquarters, and it turns out that it's like this almost Illuminati mask ball style, super strange, scene. There are also UFO sightings, there's conspiracy theories and cults and this kind of stuff. And it's a little bit on the edge of fever dreamish surrealism, but it does feel like they could all equally be like subreddits where people are actually, engaging
absolutely.
in that kind of stuff.
Well, yeah, and I mean, a lot of that is, with the masquerade ball, that's, they have these, they're called super crews, but the larger Mardi Gras crews in New Orleans in the time leading up to Mardi Gras season, they have these elaborate balls where everyone wears elaborate costumes and things like that. And so that's once again, kind of colored by the region, and as well as, UFO sightings, and a lot of these other things. Yeah, these are all things, spending time over the years, like you said, in various forums and seeing these conversations happen, or having these conversations in real life, and just trying, that reality is strange, that there is, but as we move deeper into the 21st century, there are many realities and interpretations of reality, and that the game does try to capture that dissolution of a kind of modernist conception of reality as being monolithic, and that there's this fragmentation. There's also this contest that happens between various factions, competing over what's real and what's true, and what the nature of truth even is. And that is such kind of this COVID era experience as well, that the game tried to capture. And, maybe it was to the detriment of telling a coherent narrative, but I felt like as an artifact of this period of time, it was more important to capture that experience.
Right, and there are moments of mass media. I mean, I can think of some in my lifetime. I was living in London during one of the, I even forget which one of the giant financial collapses, and there was a tone of fevered panic in the news and in the newspapers, and from absorbing media, it felt like the world was falling apart. And I have this distinct memory of like sort of absorbing all of this media and then opening my curtains in the morning and looking out, and there was just a bus going by quietly, some people walking down the street. And I remember this moment of reality where I was like, wait a second, the world is just ticking over here. But at the same time, if you do, like in this game, it seems like if you pull a couple of strands of what's going on and tie them together, They are all things that are happening there, but this seems like a very heightened moment of that type. It's like you could open the curtains on another day and maybe this would be what you would see, you know?
Yeah, no, completely. Well, that's really funny. You hit the nail on the head. I mean, there is that cognitive dissonance, especially if you spend more time on social media and things like that. But I think I used the term somewhere, like banality of the game. Kind of there is an underlying just kind of banal quality to this world that it's hard to escape this, that everyone feels perpetually underwhelmed, even though you're confronted with some of the most outlandish things you've ever seen, which is I feel like my experience during, the Trump years, during COVID, that it's like you become exhausted by how shocking everything is and how unbelievable everything is. You just reach a point of disinterest and exhaustion, and that is its own very specific kind of banal experience. And I think the game was trying to arrive at that to some degree as well. And that there's a sense, it gets referred to as the endless evening in the game, that Kay is literally inhabiting an evening that just does not end. It just goes on, and the sun never quite sets, no matter how much time passes. Mm-hmm. And that there is this feeling of like time is stuck, that we're on the, I feel like people reference and maybe misinterpret Francis Fukuyama's end of history notion, but that we've reached this point where everything, there almost a monotonous quality where neoliberal capitalism is going to, take care of everything, but we're now on the other side of that where history is ready to move on, but it hasn't. It's kind of stalled or something, and that this is a little. I'm getting into kind of a little bit of a word salad here, but that stalled quality, that feeling of motion should be happening, but it's taking so long. The acceleration is so slow. And that was something inside of the game that I wasn't trying to say the world's ending. It wasn't trying to say everything's awful. It was just trying to say that we're all kind of bored and set in a routine inside of a moment of history that just refuses to move on.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, you're putting into words more clearly than I ever have, I think, like a feeling that I've had.
I think a lot of us do. I've heard other people try to articulate it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the idea that there was a reassurance, like the US president, and I mean, I'm thinking back to like people like Tony Blair. They were like, everything's fine. And there was a feeling of the kind of the ticking of a well-oiled machine, minimal interruption during handovers of power from one elected official to another, and that everything was just proceeding as it should. But there was also a sense that something was deeply wrong with it. In the sense of, if you look at growing wealth inequality, if you look at climate disaster, you look at the failure to address those things, there's a pressure building up. And it seems like in culture we are seeing those that start to burst through, like in if you look at Brexit, and if you look at what went on in the Trump supporter storming of the Capitol and all of that stuff. It doesn't seem like entirely out of reach that if that veneer of normality kind of cracks too far, that what is beneath there is just something very, very different, and it's a reality that kind of hasn't been fully acknowledged because of that.
That's right, exactly. And it hasn't been, and maybe is still just kind of incubating, that there's something coming, that we all have a sense that something will change or should change, and it's just its arrival is delayed. Mm-hmm. And so we're living inside of this limbo until it arrives. I mean, do you feel, so you mentioned about having that experience where you were like scrolling social media and it's apocalyptic, and then you look out your window and just people are casually strolling by. I mean, is that something that's in your experience, because I know you're on Twitter, I don't know how much time you spend on it, but do you feel like social media makes you more of an alarmist? Does it give you anxiety, or what is your experience of it?
I have a bit of a mixed opinion on this one because, on that particular example, which is a very specific example, I remember opening the curtains and almost expecting to see like pillars of fire or something,
Yeah,
so
right.
it just absorbed so much that it was just. But there is like our reality that is very different to what you'll get from news or from social media.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, you look out of the window and see people walking by and everything looks normal. It's not really. It's just, everyone's got their internal lives and their internal emotional lives. You never know what's going on behind the curtains of any given house, So
Yeah,
I guess there is this idea that there's like a shared reality that we all create together to some degree. But I don't know, being on social media, it can seem like a very heightened place. I mean, in the game sphere, it is, if you see the angry people shouting at Jeff Keighley for one reason or another, because they didn't get the thing they wanted, or, but then gamers themselves are just quite happily buying FIFA and Call of Duty, no matter what the internet has to say about those games,
Yeah. Wow. That's, yeah. I mean, there's I didn't come from the game world. And so a lot of the discourse around games, I was familiar with Gamergate just because it had permeated into mainstream culture and kind of other online subcultures that I was associated with. But I think the game, games, Twitter, and just game social media, and even Steam as a forum for discussion are all very interesting to me as well, because you are, because people who are in those spaces are spending so much time in virtual places and virtual worlds that have their own micro politics, and I'm always very interested in that. But yeah, I mean, my social media habit has always been, I always tried, or not even tried. I have somewhat of a repulsion to it, but which I think is maybe typical of a lot of people. But then also it has the addictive quality that it does by design. It's engineered to do so. And so, I mean, I get like, I'm an anxious person just by default. And so it just makes my brain go in spirals. And I mean, I think one thing is I do see the chaotic quality of it, where kind of like what you're describing, where there's just this frantic, apocalyptic quality, but then you look outside and everythhing's slow and mundane. But, I think I'm in the Blue Ridge Mountains right now, which is more in terms of climate, and geomorphology, is more stable, older mountains. There's not going to be earthquakes. There's not going to be floods, coastal erosion, or these things are much less likely, I should say. But, in Louisiana, there was a kind of mundane quality day to day. You're just suffering through the heat, etc. But then it's punctuated by the most frantic moments of your life when you're either staying for a hurricane or going through a hurricane evacuation, and there's a lot of anger. You're stuck in traffic. Then you're trying to find a hotel or whatever, and then you get back and all your shit's ruined, and and so there were my reality was punctuated by a lot of chaos. And so it's like the chaos of the periodic chaos of the internet and the periodic chaos of reality were more aligned. And I think kind of like William Gibson said, the thing about the future is already here, but it's not evenly distributed or whatever. I think like the chaos of the future, the kind of perpetual distraction and difficulty of it is maybe also not evenly distributed. But there will come a time where we're all very, very anxious, and the internet is just this kind of precursor to that. It's like preparing us or acclimating us for a time when we're all just perpetually on edge, dealing with all of these ruptures in our daily lives.
And there is a very interesting version of the internet in the game as well. You talked about Duck, but there is Super Duck, a very interesting presence in NORCO. And this is, in the game, it's possible to make a copy of your consciousness called a head drive. And in the lore of this game, if I understand it correctly, one of these has kind of gone rogue and attained a consciousness of its own and become Super Duck. So it's like an AI spin-off of a person in the game. And then Super Duck has gone ahead and kind of made an internet of its own almost. It has apps that can make people work for it, and even connected to the nature and ecology of the area in a very strange hybrid AI internet of things and places and people. Is that sounding right?
Yeah, no, you nailed it. Yeah, totally. It's like a biological internet of some kind, and yeah, that was like partially inspired by like the Ethereum network or Urbit or all of these, alternative world computers and answers to the internet, and just the thought that other kinds of global networks are going to emerge that are going to be strange and alienating to us, and SuperDuck is a manifestation of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hope that none of them are quite as strange and alienating as SuperDuck, because it's quite a moment in the game when you actually see what that looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, in SuperDuck, really, like we were talking about like, and I don't want to impose this impression on you, but just the thought of just being stuck at this particular banal, uninteresting moment in history where things are happening that should be stimulating, but you're just already so overstimulated that you're exhausted by it, etc. That within that moment, SuperDuck almost did represent to me a kind of hopeful quality in the game, only because it was the emergence of something truly new and novel, but that, spoiler, I won't even say it because we'll get into spoilers there, but yeah, that hope is also somewhat squandered.
Mm-hmm. Right, I think we are kind of past the spoiler warning period with this podcast now, because we've kind of talked about a lot of the. But there is I think this is a spoiler warning point. Actually, there is something that I wanted to talk about, which is right at the end of the game, and it's kind of, I guess, the final act of it. So if anyone is still listening and planning to play NORCO, really mean it this time. Pause the podcast and go and play the game. But at the end, there is a kind of a really interesting scene where you come through the bayou in a boat and you arrive at a very strange scene. And it's the culmination of what appears to be a DIY space program.
Right.
Right? Which has got the atmosphere of like Burning Man and I don't know what else, like Shantytown and like MAGA rally, all just kind of rolled into one very strange, memorable scene. Could you tell me a little bit about what we're seeing when we arrive at this place?
Yeah, for sure. It's so the Garretts, who's like the mall cult that you mentioned, which are all of these primarily adolescent boys, but also some older men who have a somewhat incel quality to their personality and are the acolytes of a social media influencer named Kenner John. They've built a homebrewed rocket with the help of some engineers and are launching it, but they have their main antagonists in the game are a bunch of hipsters and punks in New Orleans who they call scum. And word got out that they were going to launch their half-assed rocket. And so a bunch of scum arrived to watch and celebrate because they anticipated it was just going to explode and all of these Garretts were going to die. And so that is also based on some real experiences.
I had a feeling.
Yeah, and because the game. I've seen people say like this game's not for me because I'm not from Louisiana. I'm not familiar with Louisiana, but I disagree. I think it's for everyone, but it's definitely in conversation with a lot of people and places in that region. But that was inspired by a lot of the more informal foot parades that you can find in New Orleans around Mardi Gras time that are organized largely by punks and puppeteers and things like that. And you mentioned Burning Man. I think it does have probably that's probably the closest comparison, more well-known comparison I could compare it to, but it's a lot of people making their own puppets, making their own costumes, their own paper mache, building a big paper mache bird that sits on top of a grocery cart and you just push it around all night. It's got a bunch of LED lights strung to it and stuff, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And that type of foot parade is what inspired that to some degree. And then also it took some inspiration from the monument protests, the Civil War monuments in the South, where a lot of people would show up because the monuments are being removed, and a lot of South will rise again, Confederate States of America types will show up to protest the removal of these monuments, and that those were happening in New Orleans, and were spectacles that a lot of people, including myself, would attend. And so it had a bit of that in it, and then also a bit of just like having grown up in the suburbs and being friends with, just 4chan-esque dickheads who like to shoot the shit in the swamp, and so just all of these different social milieus just kind of colliding in the swamp in order to witness this rocket launch.
Mm-hmm. Right, and after that scene, there is a sequence that was pretty striking. There are moments in the game that seem to lean into surrealism or even psychedelia to some degree, and perhaps that final sequence is the most so. Like after you've kind of boarded the ship and seem to move through some kind of quite dreamy psychedelic space where lots of characters and beings from throughout the game will come and you'll see them again and you'll fight them and that sort of thing.
Right.
It was a little bit like after all of that kind of cold dealing with computer in 2001 Space Odyssey, you get that final moment where they just kind of burst off into infinity. Was that like what was the thinking behind that little segment at the end there?
Yeah, well, that was kind of a rupture in this. One of the characters mentions this, addresses it explicitly, but I can't remember the exact phrasing. But when you're wandering around the rocket environment, you speak to someone, they basically say, I respect the Garretts and I admire them because they're trying to just punch a hole through this blanket of gray nothingness that we've all been suffocating beneath. And I think that's beautiful. And that experience that Kay has, that's more psychedelic, more spiritual, is she herself is witnessing and experiencing that type of punctuation, that for this brief, beautiful moment, something psychically changes for her and she's able to see into the past and into the future, and she's able to see her family again and reconnect with her family, however ineffectively, and that she's able to convene with her lost faith, and that she has this brief moment that's outside of time, and that time, for the very end of the game, time closes in and she returns to the limbo of reality and moves on. And that is what that sequence was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great ending to a really good game. I wanted to finish off here. I mean, I know that you've said during this chat that you're not from video game culture, especially, But it seemed to me, as someone that was very much neck deep in that as a child and teen, fell off for a really long time, and then a couple of years ago came back to it, and found very many interesting things have happened in the 20-year interim when I wasn't looking at games particularly, including the arrival of indie games. And I guess a lot of people who, like me, grew up with games and then went and made their own games, a lot of whom have kind of artistic concerns or other disciplines that they work in. And so we've ended up with some really interesting games such as Kentucky Route Zero, such as Disco Elysium, such as more recently Citizen Sleeper, games that seem to touch on ecology, politics, philosophy, and the arts in really interesting ways. And I was wondering how you feel about NORCO as part of that slice of video games that seem to be, in my mind at least, moving things on for games as a cultural medium, really.
Yeah, I mean, I'm honored that you count us in that company. I think all of those games, I haven't, because production has been so intense for NORCO, I haven't had the chance to play those fully yet, any of the games you listed, but I've kind of admired them from afar. And yeah, I mean, if we can contribute anything to that cultural moment in gaming, then I'd be stoked.
Mm-hmm. And with NORCO out now and having done pretty well, and to have been, a lot of interesting people are talking about the game, and I don't know how it's going, but it seems to be going very well. I've seen it in some pretty big media outlets and that sort of thing. How is the future looking for you in terms of games? It sounds like you've had quite a storied career and path that has brought you here. Like, are games what you do now, or is it just one thing that you've done this time? Or
yeah, I don't know. Are you what are games what you're doing? Is that kind of are you in games full time?
Only for the last year, I've kind of stumbled into a day job there. But I mean, much like you, I've kind of worked in arts and other stuff. I've worked in other stuff my whole life, and so it's pretty new that I'm doing this now. But
and do you feel secure in that decision? Do you feel like you want to move on from it, or at some point?
I tend to move on from everything sooner or later. There's a sense of reaching learning capacity in an area and feeling like perhaps I could do something else and learn more, and keep moving.
Yeah, I think I have a similar quality to my personality, but the reason I ask is because it feels, other people I talk to, it feels so impermanent. I think there's a precarity to it, especially as a indie developer, that you're relying on the whims of algorithms and things, and the sentiments of players, which can change, and that there is just such an inherently precarious aspect to it, which is okay. I think I can navigate that for a while, but I'm not sure, I think we have a really good crew. I really like the people who came together. Jesse, Jacoby, Aaron Gray, Gugali I, who's the composer, and FM Mora, who did the sound design for the game. I really love that crew, and I'd love to make something else with them. We've discussed it. But there's just so many dimensions to the game space that are just, I don't know. They give me pause. But with that said, we've experimented with some things, and there are a lot of other topics and concepts that I do want to explore through some type of interactive medium. So I think we will just due to inertia and just continuing to move along the path that we're on, probably will make another game, but I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad to hear that, and I'll be following with interest whatever you and your crew who made this game end up doing, whether it turns out to be, albums or installations or hopefully more games. We'll look forward to seeing what that becomes. Thanks very much for making the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it, and thanks for making the game.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So that was my chat with Yuts of Geography of Robots, the creator of NORCO. If you would like to follow this game online and to learn more about the group of people who made the game, you can go to Twitter and follow Robotic Geo, G-E-O, Robotic Geo. There are links in the bio there to follow Yuts and to follow all of the other people who made the art and the music and to help in the creation of that game. There's a team of 5 people, so you can follow their projects there if you would like to. That Twitter account also shares interesting developments about the game, it shares press about the game and that kind of thing. The game is available to play on Steam and the usual places. It's on Mac and PC. You can play it on Game Pass for PC if you have that kind of setup. I should have asked Yuts if it was coming to console. I imagine that it will. It seems like the kind of game that's had enough buzz to warrant those ports. But find a way to play this one. This is a really special game. It was a real fun experience to talk to Yuts about it and to get to ask those questions that I had about the game world and about the very rich and very textured presentation that NORCO is. It's a really special game. So that was a really fun episode to do. Hope you enjoyed it too. If so, please come and find me on social media. You can find me as Gaming in the Wild on Twitter, on Instagram, Facebook, even on YouTube and Twitch. I stream very occasionally. Also, I really appreciate people that rate the podcast on Spotify, share it with whoever you think might like it, and leave reviews on Apple Podcasts. All of that helps very much. And thanks again to all of my patrons. If you'd like to become one, you can do so at patreon.com/gaminginthewild. I'll be back next week with a new episode. Maybe it will be about Chorus and Silt and all of the other games that I'm playing. Hope you enjoyed this one. Thanks for listening. Take care of yourselves and each other, and bye-bye for now.